From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is the best of Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Welcome to Free Expression with me, Gerry Baker, from the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Delighted you're joining us. If you're not already a subscriber, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. What would Trump administration 2 foreign policy look like? Well, this week I'm pleased to say I'm joined by someone who knows a good deal about that, Robert O'Brien, who's National Security Advisor to President Trump from 2019 to 2021. Of course, in that role, he played a crucial part in all the big foreign policy decisions, some of them quite controversial, of the last 2 years of the Trump administration. He's written widely on foreign policy and governing, advocating for a forceful America First approach to the world, most notably in his 2016 book, While America Slept, Restoring American Leadership to a World in Crisis. Before joining the Trump administration, he was an international lawyer. And after leaving the White House, he founded a consulting firm, American Global Strategies. Let's move to the other big international crisis conflict that President Trump would inherit if he takes office in January, and that's obviously Russia-Ukraine. He's repeatedly said he could bring peace to that conflict in 24 hours. If he's serious about that, and you can tell us about whether you think he's serious, that would have to involve some kind of freezing in place, would it not, of the current battle lines that they have, which would essentially involve agreeing to let Russia hold on to large swathes of Ukrainian territory. Is that what you expect President Trump to do?
Gerry, going back to your introduction, I think what I expect President Trump to do, both with the Middle East and with Ukraine, is to return to a peace through strength posture for the United States in how we deal with our adversaries and how we support our friends and partners. And so, we've had hand-wringing in the Middle East with the Biden-Harris administration on escalation. What they're really talking about is appeasement. And they've tried to appease Iran. They tried to appease Russia. I mean, keep in mind, what led to Ukraine was opening up of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which we had shut down in the Trump administration. Biden-Harris opened the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and told the Russians, you can get a stranglehold on Western European energy supplies and have leverage over our closest allies in Western Europe. And at the same time, they shut down the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have brought 900,000 barrels of Canadian oil to the U.S. and helped with American and allied energy independence. So then Biden said to Putin, well, if it's just a minor invasion of Ukraine, incursion into Ukraine, that'd probably be okay. So if we'll just give you the pinky. And, of course, Putin tried to take the whole hand. And the Biden-Harris folks should have realized that. I mean, appeasement never works, but it's always popular in democracy because it puts off the hard choices. But at the end of the day, it doesn't work. So we've got to stop this talk about de-escalation and not provoking and appeasement and start talking about American strength and allied strength. And I think if you change that posture with the Russians, you'll bring Vladimir Putin to the table and we'll try to get the best deal we can for Ukraine. But ultimately, when you talk about what Ukraine wants to do with its sovereign territory, that's up to the Ukrainians to make that decision. We shouldn't be the ones telling them fight till the last Ukrainian to get Crimea back if they don't care about Crimea. On the other hand, we shouldn't tell them to give up Crimea if it's a national goal and they're willing to fight to the last person to get it back, then that's up to Ukraine. So we've got to learn from history. We can't go in and tell it like we did in 1938, when I say we, the West generally, and Britain in particular, and tell the Czechoslovakians to give us Sudetenland that it'll be fine because it's a faraway place of which we know little about. Instead, we ought to support the Ukrainians if they want to give up territory to save the majority of their country and save their flower of their manhood, their younger generations, but even beyond younger generations, their male population from war. That should be a Ukrainian decision. On the other hand, if they want to keep fighting to get their territory back, we should support them. But I think we've got to support the Ukrainians. But to bring the Russians to the table, we got to get much stronger than we have been.
It's interesting you say you support the Ukrainians, and I think a lot of people will be encouraged to hear that, especially from someone as close to President Trump as you. But so you don't take the view, for example, that the vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance takes. This is, as he famously said, he didn't care who won between Russia and Ukraine, and it was a territorial dispute between two countries. You do care. You do support Ukraine, it sounds like.
Well, look, at the end of World War I, Gerry, the idea was you couldn't gain good title to territory by conquest, right? Up until that time, international law recognized that if you conquered a territory, you could get title to it. That's how the empires were formed, and it was a very different world in which we lived. And after World War I and the League of Nations, the idea was a big country couldn't take over its smaller neighbor just because it could. But Hitler tried to revive that practice. It was stopped. And then it was stopped again after World War II in Kuwait, when Iraq tried to make Kuwait the 19th province. The U.S. and U.K., famously, Margaret Thatcher, you'll recall, flew to Colorado and encouraged President Bush, and we stopped the annexation of Kuwait by Iraq. And again, with, Margaret Thatcher being involved when Argentina tried to change its borders and tried to conquer the Falklands, they were driven back. So the West has kept this idea that we can't have bigger countries conquering smaller countries just because it's available. And that's kind of the basis of our international system. We can't have that happen with Russia and Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians are fighting bravely and courageously for their country. And we should support them. And we should support them in part by putting massive sanctions on the Russians. I mean, Gerry, we haven't had full sanctions on the Russian Federation Central Bank. That's something that Larry Kudlow, President Trump's former National Economic Council director, and I called for 2 weeks before the actual invasion happened. We said if they invade, sanction the Russian Federation Central Bank, and put secondary sanctions on the Chinese companies and other companies around the world that try and buy Russian oil and really hammer the Russians economically. But the Biden administration, and then Biden-Harris and Kamala Harris is involved in this, they're so concerned about provoking Putin that they've exempted Russian oil sales from the sanctions. They've exempted mineral sales from the sanctions. They've exempted agricultural sales from the sanctions. I mean, what the heck does Russia sell other than egg, oil and gas and minerals? I mean, not a lot. So the Russian economy has gone on in full force. The sanctions have been relatively meaningless by the U.S. and EU. And we're not doing a lot to support Ukraine on that front. We need to change that. And that I think is what President Trump is talking about when he says he'll get Putin to the table quickly. The way to do it is to really put the hammer on the Russian economy.
Interesting. That is interesting. Very briefly, while we're still on Russia, I must ask you about reports that have literally just come out today. Bob Woodward has yet another of his instant history books coming out next week, apparently. And one of the stories he tells in that is that apparently, the two things very briefly I want to ask you about. One is that President Trump supposedly sent some COVID testing kits to Vladimir Putin early in the pandemic. Now, you were at the White House at the time. You were very much involved in the response to the pandemic. Did you know about that?
What I want to point out is that Woodward doesn't report, as far as I know, I haven't read the book, of course, but the Russians were one of the first countries to send us PPE in response to the pandemic. Plane landed at JFK very early on when the Chinese were refusing to give us masks and gowns and that sort of thing. The Russians supplied PPE to the United States of America. And during the pandemic, we gave a lot of COVID aid to countries, South Africa, Nigeria, countries around the world, Russia included, to help fight the pandemic. It was a humanitarian gesture. I'm not recalling the specifics of what Woodward is pointing out, but there were a lot of countries that we gave ventilators and testing kits.
But it sounds as though you think it's true. I mean, can you confirm that President Trump did personally send those kits to President Putin?
Yeah, it wouldn't be personally. Trump sending things to Putin. It would be, the U.S. providing things to Russia. But I don't know what are the specifics of that. But I'm sure that during the course of the pandemic, I've got no doubt that we sent PPE and kits and that sort of thing to Russia, just like we did countries around the world. And look, we did that, Gerry, and it was really interesting. Unlike the Chinese, we didn't request anything in return for aid that we provided to countries in fighting COVID. I mean, we thought it was a threat to humanity. We provided equipment and ventilators and PPE to countries that were our adversaries. We offered them we even offered North Korea, which is facing tremendous pandemic. We offered North Korea kits and PPE and ventilators. They didn't take it, but our feeling was, and the president's feeling at that time was, once we turned on the spigot of our industrial base and we were able to produce the ventilators and the other equipment, let's get it around the world and try and stop this pandemic. And we took a very different view. It was a humanitarian view. It wasn't based on trades. It wasn't based on leverage. It wasn't based on getting something from our adversaries or our allies, but we just tried to get it spread out as widely as possible. So I have no doubt that we sent equipment to Russia at some point, but I don't know the specifics of what Woodward's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, Woodward reports supposedly, again, I'm going on the reports I read in the Washington Post, that Putin told President Trump to keep quiet about it because it would be damaging to him. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I don't recall that, but it's we gave Cyril Ramaphosa 1,000. Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, called up and asked for 1,000 ventilators, and I think we gave it to him, and it was the most ventilators we gave to anyone. And South Africa has not been particularly generous to America diplomatically, but the president of South Africa wanted those ventilators, and President Trump gave them to him. So those sorts of things were happening like 10 times a day during the pandemic. So I think the idea that we did something special for Russia is kind of absurd. We were doing this all day long, every day during the pandemic, trying to stop this thing that come from Wuhan and Hubei, China.
And very quickly, just again, very quickly, the other claim in the Woodward book, apparently, that's been reported today, is that Donald Trump had sent out his aides and had a personal one-on-one, presumably with interpreters, phone conversation with Vladimir Putin after he left office. And again, according to the Woodward book, had similar calls, maybe as many as 6 or 7 of these calls, again, since he's left office. Can you confirm that as far as you know? And do you have anything to say about that?
I'm unaware of any of those calls that Woodward is reporting. I don't know one way or the other, but it doesn't sound credible to me. President Trump did not have a personal relationship. I was his NSA. I participated in the phone calls that he had with Putin, during the time that I was in office. They were always cordial. They were head of state calls. I mean, he had a relationship with Putin as a fellow head of state, just like he did with Macron or Johnson or Xi Jinping or any of the other permanent 5 members of the Security Council with the senior leadership or Prime Minister Abe or President Moon of South Korea. So he had relationships with adversaries and allies alike. They were always cordial, but President Trump always sought in those calls and meetings to promote American interests and the interests of our allies. So I never saw any sort of a personal friendship or relationship other than a cordiality between him and Putin or him and very many other world leaders, although he did get on quite well with Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron, where he did seem to have more of a personal relationship with the two of them than other leaders.
And I should just point out, President Trump in a statement has denied these reports about the conversations and has said they're made up. Well, this week I'm pleased to say I'm joined by Steve Scalise, Republican House Majority Leader and Congressman from Louisiana. Scalise not only, of course, has been a significant leader at the top of the Republican Party for some time, but he survived an assassination attempt himself in 2017 when a gunman shot up the congressional baseball game. Scalise, of course, returned to frontline politics a few months later. I'm glad to say that Steve Scalise joins me now. Leader Scalise, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
It's great to be with you. Appreciate you having me.
Congressman, I've been coming to Republican conventions for at least 20 years. I can't recall a convention where the mood was more buoyant, stronger sense of possibility and opportunity. Seems like things have gone extremely well. What's your view?
Yeah, no, I've been sharing that exact sentiment with so many my friends, my colleagues that are up here from all around the country. And, I go back to the 1988 convention in New Orleans. I was a volunteer back in that convention. I've been to many others. The unity is something I've never seen before, the positive attitude. And maybe Saturday changed things, with the shooting to kind of put a different focus even more. But leading into that, I think there was already starting to be this crystallization of, we have to come together if we're going to get our country back. And now I think President Trump has full command of the party going into the November election. And with the ticket complete, I think, the mood on the floor was really, really positive last night towards J.D. Vance. And so I think that helps get this ticket ready to go. They're going to be on the road. There's a lot of work because there are a lot of states in play now, states that weren't in play even a week ago. And so I think it shows that this ticket is really appealing to a lot of people around the country. President Trump has shown a different side of himself. I hope tonight he shows an even more kind of renewed side of himself that brings more people into this growing tent.
Let me ask you a personal question, if I may, Congressman. You, of course, survived yourself an assassination attempt in 2017 at the congressional baseball game shooting. Mercifully, thank God you survived that and you're doing very well. As you see Donald Trump here at the convention, as you say, we're recording this on Thursday, so we record ahead of his speech Thursday night. I wonder whether you have any reflections on how an episode like that changes someone, changes the way they think about their role, changes the way they think about their sense of purpose. What effect did it have on you? And do you see any of that perhaps in anything that you're seeing in Donald Trump at the moment?
Yeah, for me, it was such an experience. It's life-changing because you almost lose your life. And to come that close, as I came in my shooting incident in 2017 and as President Trump came, as we all know, within centimeters of his life, it really does make you reflect. And for me, the reflection was what really is important in life. And, and all these things that you do in your life, I've got an incredible job. I represent 750,000 people in Southeast Louisiana. At the time of the shooting, I was the majority whip. Now I'm the majority leader. These are great, important jobs. But what's most important to me was my family. And that's what really, I think, came to light to me is like, I need to make sure that's front and center more than anything. And I still do my job and love it, but just remind you what's important in life. And I think for President Trump, I was with him Tuesday night and, we texted back and forth Saturday right after the shooting, but I saw almost a different focus on him. And, I don't know yet because it probably takes a little while, but I think you're already seeing a little bit of that same focus too, that here's a man who is warm, compassionate, and it's a side of him that most people don't see, but he loves his family. He is a man who cares so much about his kids, his grandkids. And I was so glad that Donald Trump Jr. not only spoke, but brought up his daughter to talk about her grandfather. And I think the more they humanize Donald like that, Melania Trump's letter Sunday after the shooting, I thought was so poignant because it did the same thing. And it said, look, many people don't know my husband, but he's not this caricature that the media might make him out to be. He's a person. And if he shows that more, I hope he shows that tonight, because I think that's a side of him that America would love to see and doesn't see enough. But I think they're going to, because I see it in him right now that in ways I didn't see even a week ago.
I think it changes the way people think about Donald Trump. I mean, he is, look, we're going to talk about the Republican Party, obviously, in the way he's united the Republican Party, but he still is a polarizing figure for a lot of people who really, we know what Democrats and many independents think of him. Do you think this may change the way people view, or will he still be this kind of polarizing figure for many Americans?
I think it will, and I hope it does, because in so many ways, the polarization of Donald Trump is created by the media who hates him. And there are elements of the media still to this day, you see it. There are people saying they wish the shooter didn't miss. I mean, that's disgusting. It's beyond vile, but you're still seeing some of that. And it shows you there's just pure hatred. And it's a shame. There should be none of that. You disagree with people politically. That's what America's about. But to go after them personally is not fair game. It's not something that we should accept. And I hope that comes out of what happened Saturday, that we do need to change that focus and tone. But you still see some people that don't want to give it up. But at the end of the day, why do they hate him? And I think that's something you need to look in the mirror. If somebody really does hate Donald Trump, they need to look in the mirror and answer the question, why? Here's a man who wakes up every day and has risked everything. And he was wealthy before he ran for president. He had a great family before he ran. He ran to make life better for other people. And he delivered on so many of those things when he was president. I worked with him on so many of those things. Y'all covered so much of that. What we did on tax and regulation policy to give people, working people, a real opportunity again that they didn't have. We were losing great companies in America, great jobs in America, going overseas. And Donald Trump fought to bring that back and give people opportunity. And that's what he cares about. He cares about those Gold Star families, the moms and dads who lost their kids in service to our country in ways that President Biden doesn't even care about. And that's the kind of Donald Trump that a lot of us see. And maybe if more people saw that, they would drop some of that hatred and just pure anger and maybe look at him a different way. I hope he gets a second look by a lot of those Americans, because if they do, they're going to love the man that I know, because he's a man who loves this country and he's delivered before for this country. And we need somebody who's going to go fight for this country again.
But to be fair, there are also a lot of people who are not full of hate and not driven by the media who still have their doubts about Donald Trump, because largely, I think, because of what happened after the election last time, or what happened on January 6th. And in fact, they regard him, again, we want to tone down the level of hostility and the conversation here, but there are people who aren't at this convention. Republicans, Congressman, his own vice president in his first term is not here, refuses to support him because of what happened on January 6th, and other leading members of the Republican Party have also declined to support him. It's not just kind of media-driven hatred, is it? There's been legitimate concerns among many Republicans themselves, again, largely because of what happened on January the 6th and the lead-up to it, that maybe he can't be trusted as a Democratic leader.
Well, and look, like I said, with any political figure, there are going to be people that agree with you and disagree with you because of positions you've taken. That's fair game. It's the visceral hatred for no justified reason, because, they were told that this guy's evil. They were told that this guy's compared to Hitler. I mean, those comparisons are still out there. That to me is disgusting. It always has been. And it's always been inaccurate, by the way. But that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Yeah, any president, I'm sure even Ronald Reagan had Republicans that didn't support him. Donald Trump, if you look over the last 2 months, has had Republicans that surely didn't support him in the primaries that are coming on board now. I thought it was a big move on Donald Trump's part to invite Nikki Haley to come speak, and I thought she was well received. I thought her message was really important. Ron DeSantis being on that stage as well. And look, you could have said 2 weeks ago that those camps of the Republican Party were not yet supportive of Donald Trump. I think that's coalescing right now, too. And so as we get closer to not just November 5th, but because so many states vote early, by September, you're going to have a lot of states where people in the thousands and more are going to be going to the polls or going to their, ballot boxes and their mailboxes and voting. So I think you're seeing that coalescing around Donald Trump happening now. And by the way, he's the one doing it. Donald Trump's the one who reached out to Nikki Haley. That was, maybe 4 years ago that he might not have done something like that. And so I think that's important that he's doing this, and it's a different side of him.
After the break, more of the best of free expression with Gerry Baker. Stay with us. Now back to the best of free expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Very happy to be back with you, Gerry.
You read an article in the Wall Street Journal last week called Trump Can Make America Healthy Again. I know this is a very important topic, very dear to your heart, but some of the issues that you've championed, particularly over things like vaccines and your allegations that all kinds of vaccines cause enormous harm in children's health, to public health generally, some of those, as you know, are very controversial. A lot of people challenge them. Do you think a Trump administration would be sympathetic to your skepticism about and your opposition to vaccines? And could we expect that to be a feature of health policy in a Trump administration?
Well, I don't have a hostility to vaccines at all. The term anti-vax is a pejorative that is applied to me by people who want to silence me. But it's not something I've said for 20 years. I'm not anti-vaccine. I vaccinated all my kids. I got on my own. I was fully vaccinated and compliant. I didn't get the COVID vaccine. Some of my kids did. Some of them did not. But what I am for is I'm pro-science, and I'm for removing the corruption and the corrupt entanglements, the corrupt control that the pharmaceutical industry has over our public health agencies. And I think all Americans would agree to that. I want good science. If I were in charge of, if I were president myself, I would do nothing to prevent people who are happy with their vaccines from getting those vaccines. So all I want to do is to make sure that people are well informed, that they have informed consent. In other words, that they have a full understanding of the risks and the benefits of these products, and that the products are adequately tested so that we know exactly what the risk profile is for them. I think what my issue is really common sense. My approach is common sense. And I think that's very, very threatening to the pharmaceutical industry. And as a result of that, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical cartel, the allied media tries to tar me with being anti-science and anti-vax. But I've never, ever advocated a ban on vaccines.
So what do you expect from a Trump administration? Again, you laid out a lot of things that need to be done in that article last week, and I'm sure you've had conversations with Donald Trump about this. What do you expect a Trump administration to do in terms of public health policy?
The reason we have the worst health, when my uncle was president and I was a little boy, so 10 years old, we spent zero annually on chronic disease in this country, zero. We didn't even have any drugs for treating it. Today, we spend $4.3 trillion. It's about 95% of our healthcare costs. And we've gone from 3.2% of Americans being obese to 74%. We've gone from 6% of Americans having chronic disease to 60%. We're the sickest country in the world. We had the highest death rate, body count from COVID of any country on earth. We had 16% of the COVID deaths in the United States. We only have 4.2% of the world's population. And when you ask CDC, why did we do worse than any country in the world under COVID? They say, because we're the sickest country. We have the sickest people. The average American, according to CDC, who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. So they had asthma, they had obesity, they had diabetes, and one other thing. And that's why we did worse than anybody else. So if we want to protect public health, we've got to eliminate chronic disease. Why do we have chronic disease? It's because of perverse incentives, because of the corrupt capture by the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry of the regulatory agencies. The most valuable, the most profitable asset today in America is a sick child. If you can make a child sick, which we do with our food system, the pharmaceutical industry can profit from that child forever. If he has a chronic disease, it means he has a lifetime of dependence on pharmaceutical drugs. And that is a giant profit center. And that's why, Ozempic, for example, under a new bill that's being passed in the House that is paid for by the maker of Ozempic, Novo Nordisk, it's a bipartisan bill that is likely to pass both chambers because of legalized bribery by the biggest company in Europe Europe. Ozempic will now be available under Medicare. I think it's $1,500 a month. Every American who qualifies, that's 74% of the American public. The cost of that to our country will be $3 trillion a year. You could eliminate diabetes in this country by a tiny fraction of that just by buying organic meal for every American 3 meals a day, which would be a tiny fraction of that cost. Diabetes is absolutely curable by food, but we don't do that. Instead, we pay people to eat bad food, to eat poison food like substances that are just loaded with chemicals. We use 1,000 chemicals in this country on our food that are illegal in Europe. And about 70% of our food stamp program is going to those ultra-processed foods, the seed oils to ultra-processed sugar, ultra-processed starch, and all these chemical contaminants. About 70% of our school lunch program, we're poisoning our children. 10% of food stamps goes to sugar drinks, which is causing the diabetes and obesity epidemics. And then the feedstock, which is soy, corn, and wheat, that goes into that food are these GMO monocultures that farmers are growing because they're paid to grow them. And they're paid giant subsidies. Only about 2% of agricultural subsidies are going to fruit and vegetables. The beef industry gets almost nothing. Those are the cures for diabetes. And instead, we're making people sick on one end by paying, these absurd subsidies, incentives. And then we're paying for the medicine and the treatment for life. And it makes no sense. It's destroying our country. 70% of American kids are now ineligible to join the military because of health reasons. This is destroying our national security. It's destroying our economy. It's destroying the health and happiness of our people. And we've got to end it.
Well, my guests this week are co-authors of a book on U.S. grand strategy who argue that despite acknowledging the scale of these challenges, both Democratic and Republican presidents alike in the last few years have missed opportunities to do something about it. In their book, The Lost Decade, the U.S. Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power, Robert Blackwill and Richard Fontaine trace the shift in U.S. policy, at least rhetorical policy, towards the Asia-Pacific. It began, they say, with Barack Obama's so-called pivot to Asia in 2011. Donald Trump then doubled down on the approach with tough economic measures against China. Joe Biden has continued in roughly the same vein. But, the authors argue, U.S. policy so far towards China's rise, but also in the wider Asia-Pacific region, has been woefully inadequate. And they say time is rapidly running out. The authors are two prominent foreign policy specialists. Robert Blackwill served in the George W. Bush administration as ambassador to India and on the National Security Council, including a stint as presidential envoy to Iraq. He's now a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Fontaine is the chief executive of the Center for a New American Security, a foreign policy-focused think tank. He served as foreign policy advisor to the late Senator John McCain and also worked in the State Department and White House in the George W. Bush administration. And Robert Blackwill and Richard Fontaine join me now. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us, Gerry.
What should we be doing to make this pivot to Asia a reality and to meet the objectives and fundamentally, ultimately, to meet the challenge that China poses?
Well, you can divide things into several different categories. If you look, for example, at the military side, we need a significant increase in the defense budget. So there's more military resources in general to meet the world that is on fire in many different places, where as a percentage of GDP getting toward a low that we haven't been at for many decades. And then within that, as we were trying to describe before, the issue in the Middle East, for example, is largely one of performance. It's how we use what we have rather than just how much presence in terms of military we have in the Middle East. So there's the opportunity to redeploy military resources, especially air and naval, from the Middle East to Asia to surge back, if necessary, into the region. In Europe, the United States has gone up by more than 30,000 troops since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Those troops are mostly on a reassurance mission. That number can come down back to where it was over time and so forth. On the economic side, which is a huge gaping hole in the current American approach, TPP is probably a bridge too far politically right now, but to do nothing, which is our current stance, is not the right one. And the United States could pursue digital trade agreements, sectoral agreements with countries in the region that would help diminish their reliance on China in some ways and set better rules for economic interaction. And on the diplomacy side, the continuing to strengthen the alliances in the Indo-Pacific. And here I think the administration has done some good work with Japan and the Philippines and South Korea and so forth, and linking together with European powers, particularly on technology and economic matters, to be able to withstand what China's market power is able to accomplish and differentiate away from dependence on China. Those are a few of the things, some of which have started, some of which haven't started at all. And we need to get moving on all of that.
Bob Blackwell, what would you add to that?
Well, that's a good place to start. And it's not just a good place to start, but it's absolutely essential if the United States is going to navigate through this period without a substantial threat to our vital national interests and to our way of life. So this isn't a preference. This is an absolute requirement that we do the sorts of things that Richard was enumerating. I'll just add, we need to talk seriously with China about Taiwan. I think that it's difficult to imagine a major war between the United States and China other than about Taiwan. There can be skirmishes in the South China Sea, but the golden thread is Taiwan. And I think that the continuation of policies by both sides, I must say, with too little restraint on both sides, is leading us down a road toward possible conflict and war. And in olden days, it was thought that in order to settle issues like Taiwan, not to say Ukraine, it was necessary to negotiate with the adversary, and even, perish the thought, to compromise to some degree. And I think both with respect to Russia, but also with respect to China, we're not going to stabilize Taiwan, return to a stable Taiwan element in the U.S.-China relationship, which we had for half a century, unless both sides are willing to compromise and to show some restraint in their behavior with respect to Taiwan. And at the moment, at least as far as one can tell, that neither side is willing to show that restraint. And so we recommend an intensification of diplomacy, geopolitical diplomacy. We're making some progress on climate and so forth. But the issues of war and peace between the United States and China are not being seriously addressed. Each read their talking points, and then we have more U.S. support for Taiwan, including on the military side, but not just there. And we have more coercive military actions toward Taiwan by China. And this is extremely dangerous. It's the most dangerous foreign policy issue we are likely to face in the next decade.
Well, that's it for this episode of Free Expression. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today, and indeed this week, and of course throughout 2024. Happy holidays, happy Christmas, happy Hanukkah, and a very, very, very happy new year. And I look forward to speaking to you again in 2025. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.